And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. In August 2021, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called an election more than 2 years ahead of schedule, framing the election as a decision on political parties' post-COVID-19 policies. However, most of the media and voters interpreted the election as Trudeau's quest to recapture a Liberal majority government. On today's Open Connection, we meet with newly re-elected MP Taylor Bachrach.
Yeah, well, we never really stopped working, to be honest with you. I spent a lot of my time traveling around the Northwest and back and forth to Ottawa. Just got back from Ottawa yesterday. But what's coming up on the 22nd of November is the return of Parliament, which is much awaited. Unfortunately, it's been longer than it should have been for Parliament to sit after the election. But we're looking forward to getting back in the House of Commons and, in my case, talking on behalf of people of the Northwest and ensuring that folks in Ottawa understand the issues that communities here face. So in the last Parliament, I had the honor of serving as the NDP's transport critic and sitting on the Standing Committee for Transportation, Infrastructure and Communities. I know it's a mouthful. And I was really delighted to be reappointed to that role as the transport critic. So that means focusing on issues related to transportation all across the country. Of course, here in Skeena-Bulkley Valley, it's a riding the size of Poland, and a lot of the communities are small communities far apart from each other. So transportation is a daily part of people's lives, whether it's rail transportation, road transportation, our airports and the air sector. Or marine transportation. We talk about shipping, we talk about all of the marine traffic on the coast. Those are all part of the picture when it comes to national transportation policy. And I'm really looking forward to bringing the voice of the people of the Northwest to that conversation.
Fraser Lake Mayor Sarah Story says she wants to see more communication from the rail industry with nearby communities. And she raised concerns about the contents of rail cars.
I get you don't want to necessarily tell everybody what's going in those cars, but it is important, especially with the amount of traffic, and excuse my cough, the amount of traffic that is going to be hitting our lines.
Smithers Mayor Gladys Attrell was also present. She says if an urgent railway incident happened in Smithers, the emergency response would come all the way from either Prince George or Terrace.
That's just not our community. So if we have a disaster, it is going to be our local volunteers that are basically just trying to hold people far enough away until something else comes here. And I'm not sure that gives me a lot of comfort.
Many concerned citizens also spoke to Bachrach about a variety of railway issues in their communities. Lisa, who lives in Terrace, questioned why the city has only one grade-separated railway crossing for pedestrians in the city.
A third of our students that are at the middle and secondary school have to cross the rail line every day, twice a day, and I think they're most at risk.
Likewise, a woman named Colleen from the Prince Rupert Environmental Society phoned into the town hall to express concerns about noise from rail cars and the speed of trains traveling along communities or bodies of water.
And if there's any explosions or hazardous goods on trains, we think a slower speed is needed. And we are very worried about the toxins should there be a derailment or something happen.
Other issues that were discussed include the working conditions of railroad workers, carbon emissions connected to inland ports, and the need for a signal arm at the Gitwangak rail crossing along Highway 37. Bachrach says he's expecting the rail safety hearings to begin sometime next month.
You and I talked a few months ago about rail safety. In the last Parliament, that was an issue I heard from a lot of constituents about their concerns when it comes to the transportation of dangerous goods by rail. I was successful in getting parliamentary hearings in Ottawa on the topic of rail safety, and we conducted 2 days of hearings, heard from people, stakeholders from across the country, community groups, independent experts. We heard from the rail companies themselves. I'm looking forward to picking up that work. I'm hopeful that the committee is going to see fit to finish those hearings and hopefully present a report to Parliament. That's one of the issues, obviously. Another one that's emerged over the past year is the issue of tugboat safety on our coast. And you'll remember back in February, there was the really tragic accident involving a tugboat called Ingenika that went down in rough weather just south of Kitimat. It was hauling a barge between Kitimat and Camano, and 2 men lost their lives in that incident. And in the aftermath of the sinking of the Ingenika, there were a lot of questions asked about whether the boat was seaworthy, whether it should have been going out in those weather conditions, whether the load that it was towing was appropriate. And that conversation continues, especially since on November 2nd, there was another accident involving a tugboat not far from the same area. So these are very important issues of worker safety, because every day on BC's coast, there's men and women going to work on these small tugboats, and we want to make sure that they come home to their families after every shift. So tugboats under 15 tons in size have fewer regulations than larger vessels, larger commercial vessels. So one thing I'm doing right now, first of all, I just wrote the Minister of Transport, Omar Al-Gabra, and brought his attention to this recent incident on our coast. And I've asked him to consider emergency orders to make sure that while the federal government is looking at the larger picture of commercial vessel regulations, they put some safeguards in place for these smaller tugboats that are operating on our coast. The fact that we've had these 2 incidents, one after the other, the second one being a near miss, it really raises some concerns. We don't want to have any more accidents involving these commercial vessels. So there's a whole suite of issues. I've brought them to the attention of the minister. I'm hoping to meet with him in the coming weeks to talk specifically about what improvements need to be made to the regulations. So when it comes to the safety of people who work on the water, it's very important that people have the right training and experience, that the vessels are certified and inspected, that the loads that they're pulling, the barges they're pulling, are appropriate for the size of tugboat, and that there's systems in place to manage worker fatigue. So there's enough people on the boat that people can get enough rest, and that we don't see those unsafe conditions that result in accidents and sometimes fatalities. So I've been working with the family of Charlie Craig, who was one of the young men who died in the February accident. His mother is pushing very hard for improved regulations, and we're trying to make sure that her voice and the voice of others concerned about tugboat safety is heard in Ottawa. And I'm hopeful that we can get some better regulations in place and protect workers' lives.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. While passing through a small town, Ed Stone saw the reflection of his 1920s era bust in a store window. The reflection reminded him of a greyhound dog, which later gave its name to Greyhound Corporation. In 1929, Greyhound Canada was founded as Canadian Greyhound Coaches Limited by George Frey and Speed Olson, operating in Nelson, British Columbia. Let us return to the conversation as MP Bachrach shares the impact of rural communities when Greyhound ceased operations.
And it used to be when we had Greyhound running across the country, connecting small communities, people had an affordable, safe, reliable transportation service for passenger bus transportation. Now Greyhound is gone entirely from Canada. They've ceased all their Canadian operations, and nothing has really come in to fill that void. So for rural areas of the country, you're talking about the safety of women and girls that need to travel between communities, and of course the tragic history of our highway here in the Northwest. There needs to be a safe alternative that's brought to bear. The government has promised to have a conversation about bus transportation. I haven't seen any results from that yet. So that's another very important issue that we're going to be raising. The NDP has put forward the idea of a public passenger bus network connecting communities throughout the country. We have a Crown Corporation that runs via rail. That could be one option moving forward. The thing we don't want to see is a fragmented patchwork across the country of small bus systems that don't necessarily integrate with each other. We need a way for Canadians, especially rural Canadians, to be able to get from one part of the country to another safely, conveniently, and affordably. So that's what we're going to be pushing for in this Parliament. Of course, we always have the issue of jurisdiction, and highways and highway maintenance is really a provincial jurisdiction. There are always aspects of it that fall into the federal realm. My focus is solely on the federal aspect of policy, but the larger question of how do we facilitate Canadians moving between communities across the country safely and effectively and efficiently, that's an issue that I believe all orders of government need to be concerned about. I know that with COVID, with the pandemic, some of the Remembrance Day ceremonies have been scaled back, and today to see quite a crowd out from here in Terrace and people, even all of these years since the major wars, people, including young people, are still, really serious about coming out, paying their respects, remembering those who've been lost, and paying tribute to their sacrifice. It's really good to see. And, a little brisk in terms of the weather, but I should have worn some long johns perhaps. But no, it was a really moving ceremony. And I want to thank the Legion here in Terrace for not only doing such a great job organizing the ceremony, but also hosting us afterwards down at the branch. And I'm really looking forward to be back in the future. We just had an election, and the outcome of that election, I think you and I have talked about it, pretty much the same parliamentary makeup as the last parliament. So the message that I take away from that is that Canadians want us to get down to work. They want the parties to work together. We're living in really challenging times. They don't want to see the partisan bickering and kind of oppositional politics. They want to see constructive solutions. And so that's what I'm trying to bring to the table, and certainly what I'm pushing for. Making sure that people in the Northwest here who've been struggling for the past 2 years have the support that they need, and that as Canadians, we work together to tackle some of the big issues that we're facing. One of the issues that is on a lot of people's minds, especially young people across the country, is global climate change. And we have some pretty bold promises by this federal government, but looking at their track record, they haven't really lived up to their past promises. So there's a huge part around accountability and making sure that year after year, we're doing what's necessary to drive down climate pollution, to bring in cleaner energy options for people, to support workers who are currently working in areas like oil and gas, and make sure that they can make that transition, and that as a country we do our part. I think that's really the bottom line. We only fix this problem if we all pull together, and that means everyone doing their little part of the larger problem. Or rather of the larger solution. So that's something that's on a lot of people's minds with the big Council of Committee of the Parties in Scotland that's happening, COP26. Coming out of that, and with the expectation of the federal government's climate plan in the next couple of months, I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on where Canada's going. We need to make sure that here in the Northwest, we're a part of that solution, that communities have the support that they need, that we're not left out of the conversation about the clean energy future and this transition that's going to be taking place.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. In 1911, the fishing industry began canning 5 species of Pacific salmon. Canneries were built in new areas of the coast near Pink, Chinook, Coho, and Chum salmon-bearing streams. In a little over a century, the last large industrial cannery in BC, Oceanside, located in Prince Rupert, closed its doors. Let us return to the conversation as MP Bachrach shares his concern about wild salmon stocks.
Folks across the Northwest, I think over the past 5 or 10 years, we've seen a trend with our wild salmon that's very concerning. Year after year, we see stocks that are in trouble. We see fewer fish coming back. Of course, there's always a few bright lights, but overall, the trend when it comes to skeena salmon in particular is pretty disturbing. And of course, these are fish that so many people depend on, whether it's First Nations who depend on them for food and ceremonial purposes, whether it's the commercial angling sector that depend on steelhead, whether it's the commercial folks on the coast. So, I really believe we need to pull together around this vision of rebuilding the diversity and abundance of our salmon stocks. This past season, you'll be familiar, the commercial fishery was almost entirely shut down on the North Coast. We had fewer steelhead return to the Skeena River than any time in recorded history, only a little more than 5,000 fish. So the commercial angling industry and the steelhead fishery as a whole was entirely shut down after Thanksgiving. These are troubling times when it comes to wild salmon. So one of the things that a number of stakeholders have identified is concerns around the interception of Skeena salmon by the Alaskan fisheries. And we don't have a really strong conversation with the Alaskans, particularly at the elected level. There is something called the Pacific Salmon Treaty, which since 1985 has really governed the relationship between Canada and the US and the fish stocks that swim back and forth between our two countries. And that's a technical conversation that goes on, and every 10 years that treaty is updated and revised. But importantly, it's the elected officials that represent communities and constituents that aren't necessarily involved in fishing but still value the fish as a resource. So I wanted to reach out to my counterparts in Alaska, the senators and congressmen that represent the state of Alaska in the federal government in the United States, and see if we can't strike up a conversation and talk about our shared values around salmon. I know from following the media that they have some concerns about what happens in the transboundary watersheds. And talking to First Nations and people in the fishing community here, I know there's concerns about fisheries management across the border. So I flew to Washington, D.C. That's where these Alaskan legislators are spending a lot of time these days, and was able to get a meeting with Senator Murkowski, who's one of the two senators from Alaska, and Congressman Don Young, who's been the congressman for all of Alaska for a long, long time, since the 1970s. And sat down with them and talked about some of our concerns, the things that I'm hearing. And what I wanted to come away with was a bit of a commitment around having some sort of a forum where we can raise these issues and have a more in-depth conversation in the future. And I think they were overall pretty receptive to that. I'm hopeful that we can put something together and continue that dialogue. There's simple things that we can do, things like sharing data better between our management agencies across the border, and also an important conversation about the future of our watersheds, not just around fisheries management and who catches which fish, but the larger conversation about what climate change is bringing, the challenging conditions that are going to be faced in the future, and how we work together to ensure that we have resilient salmon stocks that are there for our kids and their kids. I think that's really the bottom line. It's well over a year and a half since the start of the pandemic. I think March will be 2 years since things really started locking down. I know people are getting tired. There's certainly frustration that we're not fully back to where we were before the pandemic. But it's really important that everyone pulls together. I know I've been saying this throughout the duration, but following the public health orders, getting vaccinated is really the number one thing that we need to do to bring an end to the pandemic. And we've seen some great results in the Northwest. I was just talking to folks in Kitimat. Kitimat has probably the highest vaccination rate in the province. Communities like Prince Rupert, right from the start when they did that whole community vaccination push, and the community responded so amazingly, just came out and everyone got vaccinated all at once. I think there's some really, really strong examples of people pulling together. In some areas, there are more challenges, and we need to get those vaccination rates up. And I know that local leaders and provincial leaders are doing everything they can to share the information about where the clinics are and to share, really credible public health information, because we know that the vaccine and vaccination is the best tool we have in this fight. So really encourage everyone to get vaccinated. I know there are other challenges that are posed by the pandemic, supply chain issues, a whole host of other things. There are businesses that still haven't fully recovered. So one thing I'm going to be doing when the House returns is trying to bring those voices to the table and say, here in the Northwest, here are the struggles that we're facing. And we need the federal government to come to the table and to step up and make sure they're providing solutions for folks. So I'm hopeful, Robert, that we're going to see a continuing trend of improvement over time. We're going to see those numbers drop. One issue we've been looking at is the Canada-US border. Right now, border travel has opened up, but they're still requiring a PCR test to return. I've heard feedback from a lot of people who are concerned about that, so that's an issue that we're going to be taking a close look at.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic has caused massive changes in our daily lives. Some people may find themselves in survival mode, gathering information and resources necessary to function at school, work, and in our relationships with others. Others may be attempting to settle into their new routines. In this final segment of Open Connection, MP Bachrach shares his experiences while traveling during the pandemic.
There are two kinds of tests, and I'm not a medical professional, but there's something called an antigen test, and then there's a molecular test like the PCR test. Typically, those PCR tests have taken longer to get results, whereas the antigen test, you can get a result within 15 minutes or so. I did go down to the United States just recently to meet with the senators and the congressmen. And one of the things I was really interested to experience was the border process and how challenging it was going to be to get home. We were able to get a PCR test and get results back within a few hours. It's expensive. In the United States, you have to pay a couple $100s to get that test. But it was a fairly smooth process. Now what we're hearing, because people also have to be vaccinated with a double dose of the vaccine, there are questions about whether that is going to be necessary moving forward, whether the test is still going to be required. Of course, we know that COVID-19 can break through the vaccination, that the vaccine isn't a perfect defense against the virus. So having that test does provide a bit of a backstop. So the question is whether going forward that's going to be necessary. I've certainly heard feedback from constituents. I'm looking to the public health officials to really weigh the evidence and decide whether it's going to be necessary. But there are certainly some arguments for lifting that requirement. I know economically, the border towns along the Canada-US border really want to see that lifted. And I think just financially for people, if you take your family to the United States and you have to pay $200 for each family member to get a PCR test, that's a pretty big deterrent to travel. And certainly for lower income folks, that would be a barrier. So all of these things come down to safety. The safety of people is the number one consideration. And then after that, making sure the regulations make sense, that they're enforced properly, and that, that as we reopen post-pandemic, people are given the chances that they need to go about their lives and do the things they need to do. We're coming into a busy time before Christmas. For me, as your member of parliament, the House is coming back, but I'm still going to try to be in the Northwest as much as possible. Try to get out to those communities that I haven't visited in a while. And I'll be driving up and down Highway 16 and probably flying into some communities as well, trying to meet with people. So if there are folks out there who would like to have 15, 20 minutes with me to share their concerns or the things they're facing, I really encourage people to reach out to my offices and try to set something up.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.